Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game Battle Report. Today I am playing my Tohaa against Shasvastii and the mission is Infection. Now, you have probably never heard of this mission, which is because it's a custom mission, written for the German Championship by one of our local Munich Infinity players who has been writing custom missions for a long time and is really good at it. And this one is a very interesting example of his approach of trying to write missions that force players to actually play the mission instead of playing Annihilation for 2 turns and then play the mission last. Before we take a look at the mission though, one brief apology from me. While I decided to record this at home for better audio quality, this time I didn't take a lot of pictures and most of the photos themselves did not turn out that great. That is for 2 reasons. One, the lighting was quite low at the place where I was playing, and I am still learning how to get good at taking action shots in different lighting conditions. And secondly, this was a practice game for the tournament, so we were playing with the chess clock, and I am not used to playing with the chess clock. So I was in a hurry and didn't have the time to check if the focus on the pictures was correct or if things were blurry half the time. So I just snapped a few pics and tried to keep pace with the game, and I hope you'll excuse me. With that out of the way, let's look at the mission. Basically, the idea of infection is that there's a virus and you try to spread it to the opponent while purging it from your own troops. That's it. No consoles, no objective rooms, very simple. From a scoring perspective, that looks like this. You get 1 point every turn for infecting at least 2 units of the enemy. You also get 1 point each turn if you have fewer infected troopers than your enemy at the end of the turn. And you get 1 point for infecting the enemy HVT, and each player also has 3 classifieds. The way you choose the classifieds in this mission is a little bit different than usual. You choose one of your 3 classifieds at the beginning of each turn, and you only have that turn to fulfill that classified. That's a long-standing favorite mechanic of Thomas, who writes these missions. It's his preferred way to play classifieds instead of just having the entire game to choose whenever you want to do which one. The only board-specific thing in this mission is an exclusion zone, 8 inches from the middle in both directions. And then other than that, there is no other stuff at the table. It's just both players against each other, trying to go the last of us on each other as hard as they can. Now, the way the virus spreads is that in the beginning, the player that goes first has to choose 2 of his units that are already infected. The conditions for those 2 units are surprisingly lenient. You can choose markers as well as models. The only thing they're not allowed to do is be in hidden deployment or off the table or deploying outside of your deployment zone. So, no using impersonators to put an infected unit right in front of the deployment zone of your enemy and start infecting them. That would be too easy. The first player then has various ways to try and spread the virus in his turn. The first one is to use a skill called Spread Virus, in which you do a whip roll with 2 dice that the player can only reset against. And that's a special reset only against this skill. It's not a reset that would cancel other states like Isolated. Should the defending player actually roll a crit on this reset, they can choose which model gets infected instead of the attacking player. The second way is to simply go into base-to-base contact with another unit, and this also counts for crossing pathways when you move multiple units. So fire teams have to be incredibly cautious because as soon as one movement path crosses that of another unit, that unit would get infected. And then the third way the virus spreads is if the last unit that carries the virus on the board dies. In that case, the closest model to that last unit becomes infected, whether it's friend or foe. Then, lastly, you can actively purge yourself from the virus with a special skill that lets you perform a whip +3 roll, unless you are hackable. Then that whip +3 roll gets a -6, so it turns into a whip -3 roll. I have to admit, when I went into this practice game, I had 0 idea what this mission would actually look like on the table and how it would play out. My opponent for this game is Firas, who has been featuring on this channel before. And he actually had not only an idea of how to play this mission, he also had an idea how to break it. And we would see how that would play out. But to keep the suspense, let's just look at the lists and the table layout and see where we go from there. Let's start with my Tohaa list first. I'm playing a list that I wrote more or less specifically for this mission as well as provisioning, since that is the split I am attempting for the tournament. It's basically my standard Tohaa setup of a Sukiul HMG in a duo with a Makraul in the first group and a Sukiul Sniper with 2 Kailta in a Haris in the second group. This is basically the same across all of my lists, together with a Takiu Lieutenant in Group 2, supported by a Chaksa Auxilia in Group 1 to refill his endgame, and a Diplomatic Delegate. The rest of the list fits a few unique pieces, the first of which is a Kotail Forward Observer. User Pseudonymster, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, on YouTube actually asked on my last Tohaa battle report if I had gotten any use out of a Kotail yet. So I'm happy to tell you that yes, I have in the meantime. Unfortunately, not in this game. However, he did perform perfectly in my last game where I was playing basically the same list in provisioning, which has a forward observer bonus, and where I was able to use the Kotail speed to secure my first box safely and quickly and bring it back to my safe zone. So good job there. I also thought he might just be useful in this mission as well, since he's fast and he might help me carry the virus to the opponent. But spoiler alert, he wouldn't do anything the entire game. Not because he's bad, but simply because the game took a different turn where he never really came into play. Next to the Kotail, there's also a Kotail Preceptor with a Surda Symbiobeast to have another fast unit with an expendable peripheral that can also tie things up in CC if needed. And the rest of Group 1 consists of a Greif Operator, 2 Kaori Sentinels with Mine Layer and EM Mines, and the aforementioned Chaksa Auxilia and Delegate. In Group 2, we have 2 more flavor pieces, the first of which is the Clipsos Forward Observer. I have never played Clipsos before, but it's one of the few other forward observers you can take in Tohaa that also has a marker state and infiltration. She's also mainly here for provisioning, where she did fine last game as well. But my thinking was that in Infection, she might just be a piece that can stay hidden and not get infected the entire game, which I thought might be a useful thing. Lastly, there's a Liberto Mine Layer here. He's actually replacing a motorized bounty hunter who I had in the previous draft of this list, because my thinking was that it might be more useful to have a forward deploying mine layer in provisioning. As it would turn out, however, after this game, I might actually switch the motorized bounty hunter back in, because there is one tactic, especially if I get to go first in Infection, that I will discuss in the end, that would kind of hinge on a fast piece like a motorized bounty hunter to work. As for how this list is supposed to play in Infection, I actually had no idea. Apart from feeling somewhat comforted by the fact that none of my units are hackable, which is nice, and that I have a couple of fast pieces that can potentially move forward quickly enough and carry the virus to the opponent, that was literally my whole game plan. Now, Firas' list is something he cobbled together in the bathroom 5 minutes before the game. Again, his words, not mine. He doesn't even plan to play Shasvastii at the German Championship. He just wanted to try out something for this mission that he thought might work well within Shas. And that plan basically consisted of having 5 tiger creatures in Group 2 that would just impetuous and run forward and carry the virus to the enemy in the hopes of dying to my AROs, and then just spreading the virus to the next model in their vicinity in a corner of the table where I would be as far from his important models as possible. That was basically the way he wanted to try and break the mission, by not actually actively spreading the virus, but just having easily killable and fast stuff that would carry the virus, get killed, and then automatically force me to use a unit that is incredibly far away from everything, and then waste a ton of orders to bring the virus back into his deployment zone. And that is his entire Group 2. What else is in his Group 1? It's a Guilo Haris with 2 Jithe Cutthroats, one with the Red Fury, one with the double chain rifle. There is Agent Dukash, there is a Caliban Engineer, a Mentor Lieutenant, a MedTech Obsidon, Dr. Worm as always, and then 2 Q drones and an Ica drone. We rolled off, I won the Lieutenant role and decided to take deployment, simply because I still didn't know how the mission would play out, and I wanted to see what happens if I am forced to take deployment at the tournament and have to weather an alpha strike. I gave Firas the deployment zone on the right, whereas I took the one on the left, and Firas predictably chose first turn. Firas deployed his units very simply, just spreading his 5 Tigers around his deployment zones here, 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 and here, Then he put his 2 Jyth in the uppermost corner, which very clearly telegraphed to me that a Gwylo was coming as his reserve. His 2 TR bots were located in ARO positions here, and his camouflage markers and Dr. Worm all clustered around the middle of the board here, with his Ikadron hanging out here in the back. I had chosen my deployment zone based on the fact that I had what I felt were the better ARO positions, mostly the one from this building down here, from where I could command this long fire lane here, should his Gwylo Harvest want to move forward, as well as this table edge and the middle of the board here. So naturally, this is where my Sukyul sniper plopped down with his Kael'thas supporters, as always, on the ground behind him. My other pieces from the bottom up were deployed as follows. Right up on the edge of my deployment zone was the first of my 2 Kauri, with the mine on the other side of the building to stop a Taigha coming around that side. Right in front of her was my Liberto and his mine, with the idea being to protect the Kauri from Taighas coming from the other side. My Sukyul HMG was quite close by to the sniper, locking down this long fire lane here with her HMG in ARO, basically staring one of his TR bots right in the face, but also making sure his Taighas couldn't just run headlong into my Liberto. The Macau was snuck behind these crates here, together with the Chaksa, looking in the opposite direction. Behind them were my Kirail, with his Symbu Beast providing some additional terminal approach ARO presence, but as it would turn out, being deployed very badly, considering there would be an Agent Dukash coming in. My Takyul was up in this corner, so she could potentially endgame anything on the opposite side of that building, as well as being close enough to the Chaksa to reload during the states phase. Then we have the second Kauri here, with her EM mine protecting this courtyard, and my Kotail forward observer on this rooftop, holomasked as Chaksa long arms with portable autocannons that are being proxied by some Gulam by Firas because I forgot my Chaksa at home. I only did this because I realized too late that I had put them in a pretty useless spot, which is why one of the decoys is standing up as a very poorly disguised arrow. What I should have done, of course, and probably will do at the actual tournament, is only use one of the 2 Hollow Echoes and have them pretend to be 2 additional Chaksa Auxilia. That way, I can realistically fool my opponent into thinking that I have 15 troopers on the table, since my Clipsos is hidden deployed, and having 3 Chaksa in a list is actually not terribly unrealistic. As it stands though, my Kotail ended up not only being very clearly telegraphed in this game, but also pretty useless. Finally, when it came to deploying my Greif operator as my reserve drop, I realized that as the player going second, deploying him in my opponent's half would be a very bad idea, since all it did would be to allow him to infect him very easily with one of his Taigas. It's also an MSV piece, so trying to stop the Gwylo would have not been great, since Gwylos have albedo, which is why in the end I ended up putting him all the way back in my deployment zone next to my Kotail on the bottom of this building, where he was likely to survive the first turn and could then use his MSV to potentially pick off one of the Jyth. One more thing I should mention is that after Firas showed me his deployment and before he put down his reserve Gwylo, he pointed out that I could see 14 models and or markers on the table. Since I was sure that his reserve would most likely be a Gwylo, I therefore concluded that I would be safe from any more hidden pieces like a Noctifer or a Malignos or Agent Dukash. Here, however, was my first learning experience of the game, because when it was my turn to strip orders from him, he revealed to me that I was able to only strip 1, which told me that he had counterintelligence, which in turn told me that he had to have a mentor lieutenant. Now, if I had known Shasvastii a little bit better and asked Firas about the whip value that he used for his lieutenant role in the beginning, which was a 14, I could have concluded that his lieutenant had to be a mentor, because the only whip 14 lieutenant in Shasvastii are mentors. And that would have told me that one of his combo markers in his deployment zone had to be the decoy from the mentor, because mentors have decoy, which in turn would have told me that he had only 13 troopers on the table before his reserve, and that I had to, in fact, expect something like Agent Dukash. Luckily for me, however, even though my deployment didn't factor Dukash in, I had accidentally deployed my units pretty safely in a way that actually made it really hard for him to bring in Dukash the first turn. And so he decided to stick to his original plan and start the game with the run of his Taigha creatures. As Firas started his turn, he found out that he had actually read the mission wrong because he thought that both players were starting with 2 infected troopers. And his plan kind of hinged on that, because in that case, he would only have had to infect one of my troopers by sacrificing his Taigas, and in doing so, put himself in a 3-0 lead of infected troopers. In reality, he started in a 0-2 deficit. Still, he stuck to his original plan, chose the 2 tigers at the bottom side of the table as his infected units, and started moving them forward with their impetuous movements in a way that didn't yet grant me any arrows. To sum up the back and forth at this point, what happened in the end is that the Taigha creature on the very bottom was put unconscious by my Sukyo sniper before it was able to infect one of my troopers, and the second Taigha creature, with a couple of command tokens, actually managed to get herself into base-to-base contact with my Sukyo HMG, and, in a crazy turn of events, surviving every arrow I was throwing at it, which, to Firas' dismay, meant that while he had infected one of my troopers, the HMG, by going into base-to-base contact, there was still one non-unconscious infected trooper of his own on the board, which was exactly what he had hoped to avoid. His whole plan had been for the Taigha creatures to die, and then have 1 or even 2 of my troopers infected, and that way he could have gotten a point both for infecting at least 2 troopers of mine in his turn, and would have made it much more likely that I would not be able to infect enough of his troopers at the end of his turn. So, that was what happened with his second group. His first group decided to make a run with the Gwailo Haris. He first put down a disco baller with the Jai's Cutthroat. It actually took him 2 attempts, but that allowed him to move past my Sukyo sniper up around the upper flank of the table until he could see my Kaori Sentinel positioned on a row. Here was my second lesson of the game. If I suspect my opponent to bring a Gwailo, don't put my Kaori Sentinels on a row, even if there are Jaith as well. Because while the MSV1 of the Kaori creature is useful against something like a Jaith, it is a big liability against something like a piece that has albedo -6. So, predictably, the Gwailo puts the Kaori unconscious, and then the Jaith decides to tank the EM mine of the Kaori. However, he doesn't tank it, and instead gets isolated and drops out of the fire team. Undeterred, the Gwailo moves up the board towards my Sukyo sniper and takes an engagement with him. In a second big twist of fate, however, the dice betray Firas again, and in 2 firefights, with him rolling 5 dice 2 times and me rolling only 4 over the course of both firefights, he loses both of them, one of them with me rolling a crit, and the Gwailo actually goes unconscious. That is a huge win for me because the Gwailo is his only real attack piece apart from the Jais with the Red Fury, which he then puts in a position where he can look down both corners of the building that he is standing in front of, and then he finishes his turn, spending the last irregular orders on his Taigha creatures, repositioning them a bit, and then he passes turn. So, quick stock taking. Firas has no non-null state infected troopers on the table anymore. Both his infected Tiger are dead, and I have 1 infected trooper, my Sukiul. Firas only infected 1 trooper during his turn, so he doesn't get the point for infecting 2 enemy units per turn. I now have to infect 2 of his troopers again this turn, and make sure not to get a second unit of mine infected, since then I would lose the point for having fewer infected than Firas at the end of the turn. I also want to try and get my first classified, spotlighting an enemy unit. The problem with this? The only 2 units within reach I can infect are his 2 Jaith, and my Sukiul is staring his TR bot right in the face. So I start my turn somewhere else and call down an auto repair kit as a speedball to revive my Kaori, simply because that buys me some time to think about how to solve all those other problems. It lands, which is nice. The other speedball also rolls an auto repair kit but fails its combat jump and will never be relevant for the rest of the game. And then the Takyu lieutenant picks up the first speedball and revives the Kaori. Nice and clean. That's my 2 lieutenant orders. I then activate my Sukiul and take a face-to-face with Furious's TR bot in the hopes of getting a quick kill, but all it accomplishes is losing my symbiote mate in the process. So my Taikha lieutenant has to activate again because I don't want to spend any more orders on this firefight, and trek over to my Sukiul and drop an Eclipse Grenade on him. So I can start moving her out of line of fire of the Q drone. Before I do that, however, I decide to empty my order pool in the second group first, and I do that by activating the Clipsos, who was deployed right next to my HVT. She pops out, forward observes his unconscious Gvylo, and pops back into cover. She is taking an ARO from the Red Fury Jythe, but luckily she survives. Sweet, classified done. The last orders are then spent on the Taikha, who moves up and shoots the Tiger that run up in Furious's first turn before going into suppressive fire. I then finally go into my first order pool and try to use the Greif to dislodge his Jythe with chain rifles, but nothing happens. Then my Sukiul finally starts moving, and she has to do so incredibly carefully in order not to cross paths with the Makaul walking ahead of her, the Taikha in suppressive fire, and the reanimated Kaori until I manage to walk into zone of control of the first Jythe and declare the spread virus skill, infecting him. But the Jythe in turn makes his reset roll, not the one countering the virus, but the one to cancel his isolated state, and is therefore no longer isolated, just, dying from a deadly virus. You celebrate the wins, right? I then repeat the process with the second Jythe, and that is where I should have stopped. But because we were playing with a chess clock and I was not thinking clearly, and the whole infect your opponent but don't kill them mechanic hadn't sunk in yet, I then made the mistake of using my last order to move the Macau forward and into line of sight of both Jythe, because I was thinking it would probably be a good idea to get rid of them and not have my Sukiul killed the next turn. However, they declare dodge, I shoot with my contender, I lose both face-to-face rolls, and the Jythe with chain rifle dodges into base-to-base with my Macau, infecting him. So not only did that single last order put the score back at 2-2 infected units for both players, exactly what I was hoping to avoid at the beginning of my turn, meaning I wouldn't get the point for having fewer infected than Firas. It was also doubly stupid because if I had won those face-to-face rolls and killed both of them, Firas would actually have gotten a point because he would have fewer infected troopers than me. It's all quite complicated. Still, I infected two troopers in my turn and achieved a classified, putting me at a 2-0 lead. Yes, that could have been a 3-0 lead if I hadn't been so confused by how the mission works, but still. Firas starts his second turn and he needs to start infecting me again. But all of my non-infected pieces are behind my Cowl and my Sukiul, both of whom are infected by now, so he needs to get through those first. To clear the way, he brings in Dukash. Now that my Greif has left his position and there's a free spot in the corner of my DZ for him to land, he just drops him at the edge and he shoots my Karoil in the back. And he manages to put him unconscious, which means the Surda also disconnects. Seeing that he would then be faced with my Takiul in suppressive fire, he instead shifts toward the Jythe. He moves the Red Fury Jythe into CC with my Macau, who now has to face two Jythe at the same time, which he's really not equipped to do anymore in N5. The reanimated Kaori, who's observing all of this, lays another mine, but that's all she can do because she doesn't want to shoot into CC. The Macau predictably goes unconscious, which means the chain rifle Jythe is now free to run into the space with my Sukiul, my Kaori, and my Greif. All of them declare dodge. He dodges as well, clearing the freshly laid mine. With the next order, he moves into base to base with the Greif to infect him, and I have to figure out whether he's gonna CC the Greif or put down his templates. The Kari and the Sukiul dodge, the Greif declares CC, and my Takiul shoots. At this point, my Chaksa also gets an arrow and decides to dodge forward. The Jythe puts down his templates in a way that hits everyone except the Chaksa because it's too far away. And the Kaori goes down, the Sukiul takes a wound, but both the Greif and the Takul survive, but so does the Jythe. He then declares CC against the Greif, and my Chaksa, now close enough to be in flamethrower range, throws a Hail Mary and flames into the CC. We're not actually sure at this point if this is even allowed, but because we're running out of time, we just say, sure. And now it gets funny again, because here's what happens. My Greif actually wins the CC roll against the Jythe. The Jythe, however, makes his save, and then both of them fail an armor save against the Chaksa's heavy flamethrower, but just one, and go unconscious. So here we are again, with two infected troopers who won't count toward the total at the end of the round because they're both in a null state. So Firas, with his last remaining order, uses his Jythe Red Fury to take a face-to-face out of cover against my Sukiul, hoping, I guess, for the Jythe to get killed and tilt the balance in his favor again. But instead, he puts a wound on my Sukiul, and then he has to pass turn. Now, again, Firas only managed to infect one of my units his turn, not two, so no point there. He also only has one infected trooper left, his Jythe, and still hasn't made any of his classifieds. On my side, there is also, again, only the Sukiul HMG infected, and there's not a lot she can infect in turn, actually just Dukash, since my first group only has 4 regular orders left. I've also spent all of my command tokens already, and Dukash is the only one around. So I basically spent all of those 4 orders in group 1 to infect Dukash, and then purge my Sukiul, putting the score at 3-0 for having fewer infected troopers than Firas. Now, for some reason, I cannot figure out for the life of me what I did with my second group in turn 2, even though I had a full order pool there. I know that I tried to run my Sukiul sniper to a building in the middle before I realized he was the Sukiul that doesn't have decharges, so he couldn't do sabotage, my second classified, so we agreed to roll those orders back. Neither would I have been able to do my third classified, extraction, where I had to Civ evac his A3T. I don't know what else I did though. It doesn't really matter anyway. Firas had 3 minutes for his last turn and not really anything to do other than use Dukash to infect my Kotail on the roof, as well as my unconscious Kauri, giving him at least 1 point for having infected 2 units in his last turn. My last turn was nothing more than having the Kotail purge himself again, so I would get another point for having fewer infected than him. And at some point in between, he ran his last 2 Taigha forward, and they both died to my Sukiul sniper. I don't know if that happened turn 2 or turn 3, but that's it. That puts the final score at 4-1 for Tohaa, which was neither impressive nor did it feel especially earned. So, what was our takeaway from the mission? We definitely had a better feeling for how it worked, but we weren't really sure we liked it. We both felt exhausted from the constant back and forth of trying to figure out if we were yet allowed to purge ourselves or not, if we could kill an enemy or not, and how to keep our own infected troopers alive long enough to infect others, but also scoring points for having fewer or purge them, and just, it was a mess. Since the virus vector really only spread into the upper left corner of the table, the game also felt a bit claustrophobic, since basically the entire action of the game took place in that one little courtyard and its surrounding buildings. We both think that as the player going first, your best chance to score is probably to have a fast unit that can move up the board while avoiding AROs and then just start spamming the opponent's deployment zone with virus attacks. Since the virus doesn't require line of fire but only zone of control, it basically works like ferroware or hacking, and since the player going first starts with 2 infected on the board, there's really an onus on him to infect as many enemies as possible in their first turn. I think Firas' idea to just have your pieces be killed on the opponent's half of the table and spread the virus that way is just a bit more unreliable, since it can actually happen that you make some lucky armor saves or your opponent simply misses until you run out of orders, and then you can neither infect anyone actively nor passively since you're still alive, which is exactly what happened in this game. The question I asked myself afterwards was, should I have gone first? And if so, what would have been the most effective way to put myself in the lead? And the best solution Firas and I came up with was actually to put the Greif in a safe spot as close to my opponent's DZ as possible, and then have an infected trooper run towards him from my own DZ. Because the Greif cannot be infected in the beginning, right? It has to be inside the deployment zone for that to work. But if I can do that, then either the piece running forward will get itself killed in a row, in which case the closest model to them will hopefully be my Greif, if I play it right, and then the Greif gets infected. Or should the piece moving forward survive, they can then just go into base to base with my Greif and infect him that way. In any case, I will have either 1 or 2 infected units right next to my opponent's deployment zone and can spend the rest of my orders infecting and or killing him. If my pieces die in the process, even better. That way my opponent has to infect even more of my pieces in my deployment zone further away to get back in the lead. And that's the reason why, as I mentioned in the beginning, I am thinking about putting the motorized bounty hunter back into the list instead of the Liberto. Since the motorized bounty hunter is the fastest piece in Tohaa that I have to make that run, and I am less sad if it dies than I would be, for example, about a Macau, or much worse, my Kotail. Anyway, that was my first crack at this mission. Really interesting custom mission if you want to try it yourself. I put a link to a PDF that you can download in the video description. Otherwise, as always, if you have feedback, if you noticed mistakes we were making, or have anything else to contribute, leave a comment. I'm always happy about those. If you want to, like the video, that makes me happy as well. Little dopamine shot there. If you want to, let me know if you want to report on the next test game of this mission, because I will play it a second time to try out my theory. And other than that, I hope you enjoyed this, and I guess I will see you next time.